All right. We are approaching the end of the semester. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We've only got 2 more topics now in our unit on ethics in practice, and thankfully, they are arguably the 2 most interesting topics that we're going to get to discuss in this course. So in this lecture and in the next, we're going to be looking at the question of freedom of speech. And then for the 3 last lectures after that, we're going to move on to economic justice. To start with, I'll point out that there's a lot of confusion about what exactly the freedom of speech is. If you've ever been on the cesspool that is the internet, you might have seen this kind of confusion. And in fact, there's a good chance that you've fallen prey to it yourself. So people will complain that social media content restrictions are violating their freedom of speech. Or they'll say that people criticizing them for their views amounts to trying to take away their freedom of speech. Or else maybe they'll say that privately owned media not publishing certain kinds of opinions shows that we don't even have freedom of speech. And then finally, they might also say that people being fired from their jobs for expressing certain kinds of beliefs violates freedom of speech. This is all dangerously misguided. On a side note, the internet provides me with so many examples of how moral and political thinking can go wrong that I just have no idea what I would do without it. Now, the freedom of speech is a legal principle that protects the liberty of individuals to express views without fear of official sanction or censorship. To say that sanction or censorship is official is to say that it's backed by the state. What we're talking about here is specifically sanction or censorship by the government. Your freedom of speech isn't violated when private enterprises refuse to publish your views or when private individuals criticize you for them. It's violated when the government punishes you for holding certain views or prevents you from expressing them. That's what the freedom of speech is supposed to protect you from. It protects you from government overstepping its bounds by imposing religious, moral, or even scientific dogma on you by force. Historically speaking, the point of it was to make it possible both for experts and for regular citizens to discuss questions freely and to come to an agreement about what's correct on the basis of reasoning and evidence instead of having traditional or religious authority dictate what's correct. Now, one thing that's crucial to note is that the term speech, in the concept of freedom of speech, is usually interpreted very broadly to include all manner of expression, not just spoken and written language. So, the freedom of expression might actually be a more accurate way to put it. Actions like wearing symbols or performing rituals that express political or religious beliefs do fall under freedom of speech just as much as the verbal expression of those same political and religious beliefs. So when people argue about things like whether it should be legal to fly a Confederate flag or whether it should be legal to wear a swastika, those are definitely arguments about the freedom of speech. Now, here in Canada, the freedom of speech is classified as a fundamental freedom under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. At the same time, though, it's worth noting that in Canada, as in most European countries as well, the freedom of speech is much less absolute than it is in the United States. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms does actually allow the government to enforce certain limits on certain kinds of speech, including hate speech, obscenity, and defamation. So, in principle at least, we tend to have a little less qualms about restricting hate speech than they do in the States. At the same time, though, What this leads to is a lot more debate about what should and shouldn't count as hate speech in the first place. There are a lot of other philosophical questions raised by the issue of freedom of speech, too. One obvious question that arises is whether our right to free speech is absolute, or whether it can be limited, at least in certain cases. This is an extremely sensitive question. A lot of people would say that the freedom of speech is the single most important right in any democratic society. The reason for this, as we'll see, is that it's a condition of possibility of having evidence-based policies that take account of all citizens' interests. As a result, a lot of people are really hesitant to impose any kinds of limits on the freedom of speech. Another related question is about the nature of harm. Almost everyone agrees that behavior should be restricted if it harms other people. What they disagree about, though, is what actually constitutes harm. So, for example, they might well agree that certain kinds of speech cause offense, indignation, stress, and other negative emotions like that. But they would disagree that these amount to harm in any kind of a strong sense. So while experiencing these emotions is obviously a bad consequence, the idea is that these aren't bad enough that we can justify censoring people or punishing people for causing them. As you'll see, this is going to be the main point of disagreement between our two authors on the freedom of speech. Our first author, John Arthur, is going to deny that speech of any kind can be harmful. For this reason, he insists that there can't be any restrictions on the content of speech. In contrast, our second author, Andrew Altman, is going to say that speech can cause at least one kind of harm, which he calls expressive harm. In his view, this is going to justify placing at least some limits on the freedom of speech. Now, our reading for this lecture is Sticks and Stones by John Arthur. Arthur isn't a very famous philosopher. You can always tell how famous a philosopher is from how pixelated the picture I put up is. If it's really pixelated, like with Warren and Arthur, it's because there were only one or two pictures of them available online. When you get those nice, crisp pictures, like with Singer, that's when you know you've got someone who sold millions of books. But famous isn't the same thing as good. Exhibit A, Justin Bieber. And Arthur is an excellent philosopher. I've taught a couple of different articles of his, and it's always such a pleasure to teach him because he's just so clear and so methodical. The point of Arthur's article is to argue against speech codes that are meant to limit hate speech. The way that he proceeds is by looking at a couple of different arguments that people might make for why we should ban hate speech. Specifically, he's going to consider the possibility that hate speech causes harm, either to the entire marginalized group that's targeted by it, or else to certain individual members of that group, as well as the possibility that it could be a nuisance. As you'll see, he's going to reject both of those possibilities. According to him, neither of these two arguments works. As a result, he's going to conclude that we shouldn't have legal restrictions against hate speech. At the same time, though, it's important to note that that obviously doesn't mean that he thinks that hate speech is morally just fine. We can definitely criticize people for perpetuating hate speech, but that's not the same thing as the government stepping in to censor or punish them. Let's move on to the details now of Arthur's position. It's really important to point out right from the outset that Arthur is specifically concerned with the issue of regulating hate speech. Hate speech refers to the public expression of hatred or violence toward a person or group based on some characteristic like their race, their religion, their sex, their gender, or their sexual orientation. What Arthur wants to know is whether or not we're justified in restricting the freedom of speech in order to limit one kind of speech in particular, namely hate speech. It's worth saying a couple of words here about the context. Arthur wrote this article in the early 1990s in the middle of a huge controversy about free speech on university campuses. In 1990 and 1991, hundreds of universities across the United States responded to incidents of hate speech on campus by passing what they called speech codes. And speech codes are just rules restricting certain words, certain symbols, or certain gestures beyond the limits that are already set by law. This is a really important point to understand this debate. Pretty much everybody agrees that certain things are not protected by freedom of speech. One obvious thing is harassment. Now, as we saw in Superson last lecture, defining harassment can be a very tricky thing. But generally speaking, if something is a pattern of behavior that interferes with a person's being able to live their life, then it counts as harassment and is therefore not protected by free speech laws. Some other kinds of speech that aren't protected include libel, slander, and fighting words, which is speech explicitly calling for violent action. What distinguishes speech codes is that they impose further restrictions on speech than the ones already imposed by laws against things like harassment, libel, slander, and fighting words. And they do this by banning certain words, symbols, or gestures. Some examples of things that they might ban are racial epithets, meaning derogatory terms that are used to designate members of certain races or ethnicities, and symbols associated with hate groups like the Confederate flag or the swastika. Another really important thing to highlight about the concept of hate speech is that it isn't usually understood to include all expressions of hatred. Rightly or wrongly, when people say that hate speech should be illegal, they aren't usually talking about things like harsh criticism of the police or of government officials. And that includes when these things involve calling them derogatory names, like, for example, calling police officers pigs, calling conservative politicians fascists, or calling liberal politicians communists. Instead, they're specifically talking about speech that expresses hatred for members of historically disadvantaged racial, religious, ethnic, or sexual groups. These groups include Black and Indigenous populations, Muslims and Jews, and the LGBTQ community, among others. Now, Arthur's starting point is to ask what is supposed to justify this. So what justifies the attempt to limit offensive, degrading, or hurtful speech for some groups, but not for others? This is the question that he's going to be trying to answer. But to answer this question, we need to raise a lot of others about why the freedom of speech is important in the first place and about the different kinds of harms that can be caused by hate speech. So let's move on to those questions now. The first question that Arthur addresses has to do with the importance of the freedom of speech. Most people do believe that we should have a right to free speech. But why? What's so valuable about having the legally protected option to express ourselves in whatever way we choose? Arthur goes over 4 different reasons for why the freedom of speech is such an important right. The first reason is that having free and unconstrained debate is crucial for the pursuit of truth. This is something I alluded to a little bit earlier. In the Middle Ages and in the early modern period, there was a very close relationship between religious and government institutions. And the result was that governments could punish people for making scientific and philosophical claims that contradicted official church doctrine. I'm sure you know that this happened to scientists like Galileo, who questioned the Catholic Church's geocentric model of the universe, but it also happened to philosophers like Kant, who criticized the existing political order. The result was that it was impossible to make progress in certain areas of knowledge. To pursue truth in science and philosophy, it has to be possible to question any claim to truth and to propose new claims to truth. We can't just declare some ideas to be true or false by default without examining ideas that contradict them. What Arthur says is that even false ideas are necessary if we're going to prevent truth from becoming a dogma. The idea is that if we have some official authority declaring what things are true once and for all, our truths harden into unreflective dogmas that we're no longer willing to question. And as a result, they lose their link with evidence and with reason. So that's the first reason why freedom of speech is so important. The second reason is another one that I've alluded to already, which is that the freedom of speech is essential to democratic decision-making. In modern democratic societies, public opinion is supposed to help shape government policy. What that means is that, in theory, the interests of the people who are governed are supposed to guide the decision-making process. Now, in reality, of course, it's actually the interests of our ultra-wealthy corporate overlords that guide the decision-making process, but in theory, that's the way it's supposed to work. What Arthur says, though, is that fair decision-making like this can't possibly occur unless elected officials and citizens can freely criticize and debate policies. We can only ensure that policies reflect the interests of citizens if all citizens have the right to express their interests without any obstacles, to criticize existing policies, and to debate important political issues with others. Making certain laws immune from questioning or banning certain issues from public dialogue is thoroughly anti-democratic in the sense that it removes them from the sphere of decisions that are open to public opinion. Once again, these laws harden into unreflected dogmas and they lose their link with the interests of the people who are governed. So that's the second reason for why freedom of speech is so important. Then the third reason is that the freedom of speech embodies the value of autonomy. Now, we've talked a lot about autonomy in this course already. If you'll recall our lecture on Vellman, you'll know that the concept of autonomy is used in two different senses. In the original Kantian sense of the term, autonomy refers to the ability of rational beings to set their own goals in opposition to their instincts. In contrast, in the modern sense that we saw in Hooker, autonomy refers to having control over one's life, or having options. Now, of course, the two concepts are related, but they're far from being the same thing. Now, you might recall that there was a bit of a debate between Hooker and Vellman about whether autonomy is intrinsically good. Hooker said that having more options is part of what makes our life go well, whereas Vellman said that having more options can actually sometimes harm us. But even though Vellman thought that autonomy is sometimes harmful, he certainly didn't want to deny that it's often good too. Pretty much everyone agrees that in some, or maybe even most cases, having control over your life is a good thing. That's exactly what Arthur is saying here. He explicitly says not only that having the freedom of speech gives us more control over our lives, but also that it contributes to our quality of life. In other words, having the freedom of speech gives us more control over the kinds of things we can say, and having that extra control makes our lives go better. So that's the third reason for why freedom of speech is important. Then finally, the fourth reason is that the freedom of speech is a basic human right that reflects the equality of all citizens. Now, notice that this reason is of a different kind from the other three. What Arthur says is that the other three reasons all have to do with the social utility of the freedom of speech. The term utility here simply means usefulness. In other words, they all have to do with freedom of speech being instrumentally good, or good as a means to certain ends, namely the ends of advancing knowledge, of achieving fair decision-making, and of increasing people's quality of life. Yet another way to put the very same point is to say that in all three of these cases, the freedom of speech is good for its consequences. In contrast, to say that the freedom of speech is a basic human right is to say that it's also something that we have to respect for its own sake, independently of any consequences that it may have. The idea here is that we owe everyone equal respect, and part of what it means to give everyone that equal respect is to give them an equal chance to have their opinions heard. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that everyone's opinion is equally valuable. Someone who makes a blatantly false claim or who reasons in an illogical way is obviously not contributing anything valuable to a discussion. What it does mean, though, is that we can't decide whether someone's contributions are valuable before we even give them a fair hearing. So those are 4 reasons why respecting the freedom of speech is important according to Arthur. It's instrumentally good as a means for pursuing truth, for ensuring fair decision-making, and for promoting our quality of life, and it's also intrinsically worth respecting as a basic human right that reflects the equality of all citizens. Because of all this, Arthur claims that the freedom of speech might actually be the single most important of all rights. Actually, by a complete coincidence, I just happened to be walking past the Amnesty International building here in Ottawa while I was writing my notes for this lecture. And they have a monument there with a quotation from the Chinese activist Liu Xiaobo that says, "Freedom of expression is the foundation of human rights." Arthur would definitely agree with that. Freedom of speech is the starting point of democracy, and it's the starting point of evidence-based policy. At the same time, though, Arthur says that the freedom of speech is very fragile. It's very easy for us to lose it. He says that there are 2 reasons for this. The first reason is that any kind of limitation to the freedom of speech can have the effect of banning valuable speech. As I've already pointed out, respecting everyone's freedom of speech definitely doesn't prevent us from making a distinction between valuable and valueless speech. Someone who presents new evidence to suggest that existing government policies have weakened the infrastructure needed to respond to a global pandemic is obviously making a valuable contribution. In contrast, someone who links YouTube conspiracy videos that claim that the pandemic was pre-planned by the Chinese government and bases their argument on a racist rant against Asians is obviously not making a valuable contribution. This is a pretty easy distinction to make. But, according to Arthur, as soon as we try to impose limits to ban people from making valueless contributions, we run the risk of accidentally banning valuable contributions as well. He says that one of the reasons for this is that the words that we use to justify banning certain kinds of speech are vague and indeterminate. When people explain what kind of speech should be banned, they'll often say that it should be banned if it expresses hatred, if it denigrates a certain group of people, if it victimizes them, or other synonymous expressions. The problem, though, is that none of these words is precise enough to make sure that only valueless speech is banned. Do critiques of violent radical religious groups, whether they're Christian, Islamic, Jewish, Hindu, or otherwise, amount to hatred of those religions? Do scientific studies trying to determine whether racial differences are biological denigrate the races in question? Do arguments for why we shouldn't defund the police victimize groups that are frequently the subject of police brutality? There are definitely people who have claimed that they do, and yet every single one of these is potentially valuable speech that raises legitimate political and scientific questions. One major risk of speech codes that limit the freedom of speech is that they might end up excluding things like these as well. So that's the first reason for why the freedom of speech is so fragile. Then the second reason is that any censorship can potentially lead to a slippery slope. Now, because we've all been paying very close attention during lectures and reviewing our notes regularly, we remember from the lecture on Hooker that a slippery slope refers to something having unintended consequences. More specifically, it refers to a minor step leading to a chain of further steps that will amount to something major that was unintended. Remember, in the context of the euthanasia debate, the concern was that the minor step of allowing physicians to kill patients with their consent might lead to a major change in our attitudes against killing. The slippery slope argument in the debate around the freedom of speech is similar. The concern here is that taking the minor step of banning certain unpopular minority opinions and controversial ideas might lead to political repression. Let's consider an example of this. Suppose that censorship begins by banning certain Islamophobic ideas, like, for example, the claim that Islam is a religion of violence. From there, it might easily be taken a step further to ban people from expressing legitimate concerns about Islamic fundamentalism, which obviously is a problem no less than Christian fundamentalism is in the United States, and Jewish fundamentalism is in Israel, or Hindu fundamentalism is in India. And then from there, it might even be taken a step further to censor opinions that have nothing to do with Islam per se, but that are often associated with critiques of Islam, for example, the opinions of people who advocate for keeping religion and politics separate. The result of all this would be to repress the views of people with completely legitimate political concerns by gradually expanding the definition of what counts as Islamophobia. So those are two reasons for which the freedom of speech is very fragile. First, it risks banning valuable speech, and second, it risks leading to political repression. Because the freedom of speech is fragile in these kinds of ways, Arthur says that we need a solid wall of constitutional protections to guard citizens against attempts to limit free speech. In other words, the Constitution of any democratic nation has to include protections that prevent free speech from being limited for just any reason. All right, so far, everything that Arthur has said has basically been a primer on why the freedom of speech is important and why we need to protect it. According to him, the freedom of speech is arguably the single most important right, and for that reason, we need strong constitutional protections against attempts to limit it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there's never any reason to limit free speech. As I pointed out earlier in the lecture, almost everyone agrees that the freedom of speech doesn't cover harassment and that it doesn't cover fighting words, among other things. What it does mean, though, is that you have to have very good reason to limit it. This tells us what the next step in Arthur's argument has to be. He has to ask, what are the reasons for which we might want to ban hate speech? What he says is that people who want to ban hate speech often claim that it harms its victims. They say that hate speech doesn't just offend people or cause them distress, but that it actually harms them just the way it would harm them if you were to hurt them physically or to steal their property. Now, it's important to draw a distinction here between the concept of being wronged and the concept of being harmed. According to Arthur, wronging someone simply refers to doing something unjust to them. For example, murdering me wrongs me since it infringes on my right to life. But trespassing on my property wrongs me as well. It infringes on my right to property. But harming someone, that refers to something stronger. Harming someone involves doing something that sets them back by frustrating their interests in an important way. The way that Arthur explains this is that harming someone interferes with something that's of ongoing concern for them and in which they have a stake. So, for example, murdering me obviously does harm me, since it frustrates my interest in living, which is of great concern to me and in which I do have a stake. Now, what Arthur points out, though, is that it's definitely possible to wrong someone without harming them. In other words, it's possible to act unjustly towards someone without frustrating their interests in any significant way. This should be pretty obvious from the example of trespassing. When you trespass on someone's property, you are doing something unjust, but it's also something relatively trivial. In contrast, harming someone is never trivial. It's always significant. And according to Arthur, this is why it can be regulated. In other words, this is why we can have laws against it. So this tells us the purpose of introducing the distinction between being wronged and being harmed. Limiting the freedom of speech won't be justified if hate speech merely wrongs people. It's only going to be justified if we can show that it harms people too. So at this point, the question becomes, does hate speech harm people? To answer this question, Arthur asks what kinds of harms hate speech might cause. And he considers two possible candidates. So these are two kinds of harms that people who are in favor of speech codes often say are caused by hate speech. The first of these is group harm, and the second is cumulative harm. Let's look at each of these in turn. As I said, the first kind of harm is group harm. And group harm is harm that's caused to a group itself, as opposed to any individual member of that group. Now, there's definitely a question here about whether it's even possible to harm a group as such, apart from the harm that's caused to its individual members. There are some people who would say that it is, and others who would say that it isn't. Arthur himself actually agrees that it is possible, but only under certain special circumstances. He gives the example of a corporation. A corporation can have certain goals that are its own goals as a corporation, as opposed to the goals of any of its directors, corporate officers, or shareholders. Directors, corporate officers, and shareholders play their own roles in the corporation, and their individual goals are the fulfillment of those roles. But over and above those individual goals, there are goals of the corporation itself, which don't necessarily need to be shared by its members. Let's consider the example of a university. A university is a kind of corporation. It has all kinds of members. It has students, professors, administrative staff, deans, a president, and so on. Each of these members has its own goals. For example, the students have the goal of passing their classes and of getting their degree. Or, judging from some of the papers I get, maybe just to party all the time and do no real work. Then the professors have the goal of imparting knowledge of their particular subjects. The administrative staff have the goal of coordinating courses, and so on. But the university as a university does have goals over and above any of these individual goals, like, for example, sustaining itself as a financially viable institution. And the reason it has those goals is because of its particular organizational structure. It's organized in such a way as to keep itself financially viable. That organizational structure gives it the inherent goal of keeping itself viable. And to the extent that it has that goal, it can be said to have interests, which also means that it can be harmed as a corporation. What all of this does is it gives us an account of what a group needs in order to be harmed as a group. As we've seen, harm involves frustrating someone's interests in an important way. So it's only going to be possible to harm a group if it has certain collective interests as a group over and above the interests of its individual members. And in turn, that's only going to be possible if that group has an organizational structure that's designed to pursue certain goals. But if all of this is correct, then it should be obvious that it's going to be impossible to harm identity groups like, for example, races, religions, and sexual orientations. Races, religions, and sexual orientations don't have this kind of an organizational structure. In fact, apart from a couple of exceptions for highly centralized religions like Catholicism, none of these groups are even organized at all. It isn't as though there's a black race that's structured to pursue certain collective goals, and then a white race that's structured to pursue other collective goals, and so on. Instead, there are just individual members of the black and white races pursuing their own individual goals, like having enough to sustain themselves and their families, enjoying the pleasures of life freely and without fear of oppression, and so on. They don't have collective racial interests over and above the individual interests of individual members. And what that means is that it isn't possible to harm races, religions, or sexual orientations as such. It's only possible to harm their individual members. So our question was, what kind of harm hate speech might cause? We started by considering the possibility that it might cause group harm. But if Arthur is correct, then hate speech can't possibly cause group harm because the kinds of groups that it targets don't have collective interests. This brings us to the second possibility, which is that it might cause cumulative harm to individuals. To say that something is cumulative is to say that it increases in degree as a result of successive additions. So, cumulative harm refers to harm that's caused by the accumulation of different actions that individually aren't themselves harmful. There are plenty of examples of things that are negligible on their own, but that can have a significant impact if they're done repeatedly or if they're done by a lot of different people. Arthur gives the example of pollution. A single person using a motorized vehicle once or twice would do literally no damage at all. The effects of it would be completely indiscernible. But 1.5 billion people using motorized vehicles every day does plenty of damage. It has a tremendous impact on human health, on water quality, on vegetation, and on aquatic life, among other things. So the idea here is that the kind of harm caused by hate speech could be like this. Although one instance of someone using a racial slur or making a derogatory comment might not constitute harm on its own, the accumulation of cases taken together can lead to harm. According to Arthur, there are two ways that people have tried to claim that hate speech causes cumulative harm like this. The first is that the accumulation of cases of hate speech can lead to lower self-esteem for the people who are targeted by it. What this argument claims is that constantly being made the object of things like slurs and derogatory comments might reduce a person's sense of their own worth. And reducing a person's sense of their own worth amounts to harming them. Then, the second way that people have claimed that hate speech causes cumulative harm is that it leads to increased chances of violence. What the argument claims in this case is that the presence of hate speech can gradually legitimate violence against certain minorities, which obviously harms them. Arthur rejects both of these arguments. According to him, neither of them presents a convincing reason for why hate speech can harm someone. Let's look at each of these arguments in turn. The first argument claimed that hate speech can have the cumulative effect of reducing someone's self-esteem. Now, the first thing to point out is that it isn't even clear that low self-esteem really is a harm in the relevant sense of the term. Remember, Arthur has defined harm as something that frustrates an important interest of ours, and for that reason, a harm can be regulated by law. We can have laws against it. And yet, there are plenty of things that do reduce people's self-esteem, but that we obviously don't think should be regulated by law. As an obvious example, being repeatedly rejected on a dating app can lower someone's self-esteem. And yet, nobody thinks that there should be a law against rejecting people on dating apps. But in any case, let's assume that low self-esteem really is a harm. What Arthur says is that even if we do assume this, it's still unclear how plausible it is to say that hate speech has the effect of reducing it. The reason for this is that low self-esteem is usually the result of several different factors. Some of these factors are systemic. For example, constantly seeing members of your own group portrayed negatively in the media. Others are personal, like, for example, having an unstable family environment or performing poorly at work or school. Arthur's point here is that without these other systemic and personal factors, it's very unlikely that hate speech on its own would do very much to lower a person's self-esteem. Just to illustrate, imagine someone who had never been the victim of systemic discrimination, who was relatively well off, had a very stable upbringing, was currently in a loving long-term relationship, had a university education, and also had a well-paying job. And now imagine that there was some political movement making derogatory comments about this person's race. And imagine further that this movement gained a lot of media attention, and so that this person heard about them on the news and on social media all the time. Now, although this might be distressing, it's hard to see why these derogatory comments would affect this person's sense of self-worth, even if he were exposed to them every day. So even if we do grant that low self-esteem is a harm, it doesn't seem that hate speech alone is what causes it. As a result, this argument doesn't establish that hate speech actually causes harm. Now let's move on to the second argument. What the second argument claims is that hate speech causes cumulative harm by increasing violence against the group that it targets. Now, the first thing to point out here is that it isn't clear at all that that's true. What Arthur says is that even if we could show that societies with more hate speech against a certain minority group were also societies with more violence against that same group, there would still be no way to show that the hate speech were the cause of the violence. What he says is that, in fact, it may well be the other way around. In other words, it may be that it's because violence against certain groups has been normalized that hate speech against them increases. But in any case, let's assume that hate speech really does increase violence against minority groups. What Arthur says is that even if that's true, banning hate speech for this reason has the problem that it treats human action causally. What that means is that it treats the actions of those who commit violence as though they were literally being caused by the hate speech instead of being under their own control. Even if hate speech does actually lead to increased violence, that violence is the fault of the people committing it, not the fault of the people saying hateful things. And what that means is that the harm isn't being caused by the hate speech itself. Instead, it's being caused by people acting violently out of their own free will. So this argument doesn't establish that hate speech causes harm either. Of course, although expressions of hatred and prejudice are protected by freedom of speech, things like assault and discrimination obviously aren't. And according to Arthur, the answer to violence against minority groups isn't to pass new censorship laws limiting free speech. Instead, the answer is to enforce the laws that we already have against assault and discrimination. So far, Arthur has been exploring possible arguments for why we should have speech codes banning hate speech. He's considered the argument that hate speech inflicts harm either to groups or else to individuals, and he said that neither of these is very convincing. So then the next question is, might hate speech be banned on other grounds than because it causes harm? There are plenty of things we have laws against, even though they don't actually cause harm. For example, things that are a nuisance. This is why we have noise bylaws. Noise of a certain volume and at a certain time of the day is a nuisance. So could hate speech be a nuisance like this too? At this point, Arthur introduces a distinction between the content and the context of a behavior. The context of a behavior, like say speech, is the topic that it talks about. In contrast, its context is the situation in which it happens. Now, the point of free speech is that it's supposed to be completely neutral regarding content. In other words, it isn't supposed to place any kind of limits on the kinds of things that we can say. That's what makes it so important for pursuing truth and for ensuring fair decision-making. But there's nothing at all preventing us from imposing limits on the context in which you say these things. And as it turns out, the laws against those things that we consider to be a nuisance don't actually limit the content of what you can say at all. Instead, they only limit its context. They limit things like where you can say it, at what time, and at what volume. The example that Arthur gives is that we definitely do have reason to prevent people from yelling about the virtues of Nazism on a bus. But the reason for this isn't the content of their speech. It isn't because of the particular things that they happen to be saying. Instead, it's because of the context in which they're saying it. That's what makes it a nuisance. You can see that these restrictions have nothing to do with content from the fact that they would also apply to people who are yelling about the virtues of, say, the Democratic Party or the Socialist Party or whatever else. According to Arthur, there's no problem at all with restrictions on context like this, but we need to make sure that there are no restrictions on the content of speech. So the question is, can we ban hate speech in a way that is content neutral? Once again, that means, can we ban it in a way that doesn't specifically say that certain topics or that certain opinions about those topics are off limits? He considers 3 different ways that we might try to do this. So these are 3 ways of trying to word speech codes in order to specify what kind of speech they restrict without imposing any limits on content. The first possibility he considers is appealing to the criterion of causing substantial distress. The idea here would be that any speech causing intense negative emotions, like anguish, sorrow, and discomfort, should be restricted. But according to Arthur, this criterion would obviously be much too wide. People are offended by all kinds of things. Conservatives may feel all kinds of distress from seeing gay or transgendered people represented in media. Christians, Muslims, and Jews might all feel anger or indignation listening to atheists argue that there's no God. Students might feel insecure and uncomfortable listening to a philosophy professor talk about controversial topics like abortion, infanticide, and bestiality. If we banned all speech that causes substantial distress like this, we'd basically have to deny freedom of speech altogether. This leads us to the second possibility, namely, appealing to the criterion of causing significant distress specifically to a historically stigmatized group. So, in this case, you'd still be banning speech that causes negative emotions, but only to groups that have a history of being marginalized or oppressed on the basis of things like their race, their sex, their gender, their sexual orientation, or their religion. But here again, Arthur says that this would be much too wide. It could potentially prevent all kinds of perfectly legitimate scientific, historical, and philosophical research that are important in the pursuit of truth and in fair decision-making. Think, for example, about research into genetic differences between races. Now, as we saw in Michelle Moody Adams, there are good reasons to think that a lot of this research is flawed. But that's not the same thing as saying that it shouldn't even be done in the first place. And more importantly, it's only if there is freedom of speech that we can even do the good research that shows that the bad research is bad. The same thing goes for research into genetic differences between the sexes, as well as research into the history of religions and philosophical arguments about controversial topics, and so on. All of these could offend historically stigmatized groups, and yet they're all examples of legitimate research. So then, finally, this leads to a third possibility, namely that only epithets should be banned. As I already pointed out, epithets are just derogatory terms that are used to insult someone. The idea here is that unlike, say, scientific research, epithets are never valuable speech. They never carry important information that makes them worth protecting. According to Arthur, though, this is actually false. Epithets do carry information. They express attitudes like disgust, indignation, and anger, and these add to the content of what someone is saying. Now, if you are having trouble seeing how this might be important information or how it might be worth protecting, it's probably because you're only thinking of things like racial epithets or homophobic slurs. But think about the examples that I cited early on in the lecture. An activist who calls the police pigs is using an epithet. But that epithet is not only useful in stirring up emotions, it also carries information about that person's attitudes. The same thing is true of people who protested the Vietnam War with the slogan, "Fuck the draft." We generally think that these kinds of expressions of intense disgust and indignation are politically legitimate. So speech codes banning epithets would actually violate the freedom of speech by banning all kinds of legitimate expressions of political dissent. So where exactly does all of this leave us? Well, Arthur said that there shouldn't be restrictions on the content of speech, but only on its context. And from these three arguments, he concludes that there's no way to ban hate speech by its context alone without also infringing on the freedom of speech. As a result, he says that hate speech shouldn't be banned at all. Now, to be clear, to say that hate speech shouldn't be banned is to say that engaging in it should be a legally protected option. It just means that the government shouldn't be able to interfere when people say hateful things. I hope it's clear that this obviously doesn't mean that it's morally acceptable. We should definitely refrain from saying these kinds of things ourselves. We should criticize others when they say it, and we should raise our children to do the same. But that isn't the same thing as saying that the state should censor them. And as we've seen, it isn't the same thing as saying that harassment should be tolerated either. Harassment laws are content neutral. They protect everyone from harassment, no matter their race, their sex, their gender, their sexual orientation, their religion, and so on. And for that reason, they don't pose any kind of a problem. Now, let's briefly summarize Arthur's position. Remember, Arthur is asking about whether it's a good idea to have speech codes that impose further limitations on speech besides what's already banned by existing laws against harassment, libel, slander, and fighting words by banning hate speech as well. He starts off by pointing out that the freedom of speech is arguably the most important right. Not only is it instrumentally useful in the pursuit of truth, in ensuring fair decision-making, and in promoting personal autonomy, but it's also intrinsically worth respecting insofar as it expresses the equality of all citizens. Given how important the freedom of speech is, we're going to need very good reasons if we're going to limit it. So then Arthur asks just what these reasons might be. The first possibility that he considers is that hate speech might cause harm. This harm might be collective, in which case it harms a marginalized group as such instead of harming its individual members. Or else it might be cumulative, in which case it harms individual members, either by reducing their self-esteem or else by causing violence against them. Then the second possibility is that hate speech could be a nuisance. Arthur rejects both of these possibilities. In the first place, he says that hate speech doesn't actually cause harm. It can't cause group harm because racial, sexual, ethnic, and religious groups don't have collective interests over and above the individual interests of their members. Nor can it cause individual harm. Hate speech doesn't lower self-esteem on its own. Other factors do that, and those factors are the problem, not the hate speech. Similarly, hate speech doesn't directly cause violence since people are free not to act violently. Here again, it's the violence that's the problem, not the hate speech itself. In the second place, hate speech can't be treated as a nuisance because it can't be banned in a way that's content neutral. From all of this, Arthur concludes that we shouldn't have speech codes banning hate speech. We can criticize people for their views, but not use state censorship to shut them down. In our next lecture, we're going to look at Speech Codes and Expressive Harm by Andrew Altman. Unlike Arthur, Altman does think that there's good reason to have speech codes, at least in certain kinds of public institutions like universities. As we go through his argument, it'll be interesting to consider to what extent he agrees with Arthur and to what extent he disagrees. One question to ask ourselves is whether Altman actually manages to give convincing responses to the arguments we saw today, or whether these arguments are enough to show that he's wrong.